Rob Jordan. I'm the CEO of the Housing Agency in Ireland. I'm delighted to be speaking to the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials. The Housing Agency is a government body in Ireland that works with the Department of Housing, which is the equivalent of HUD, local housing authorities and non-profit housing providers to increase the supply of social and affordable housing, ensure that adequate housing and supports are provided to groups that are sometimes excluded from the housing system, people with disabilities, people who are homeless, older people. And we are also, our full title of the agency is the Housing and Sustainable Communities Agency, so we're really committed to fostering and promoting sustainable communities throughout Ireland.
COVID-19 impacted and affected every part of life in Ireland, and 2.5 years on, we are still feeling the impact and effect on our lives. Prior to COVID-19, the Irish housing market was experiencing significant supply, affordability and viability issues. These have also been now exacerbated by the pandemic. Construction was restricted for part of the time, and so we actually here in Ireland experienced the highest number of total days in lockdown in the EU. However, at the beginning of the pandemic, government departments, agencies and local authorities quickly adapted and developed appropriate and innovative responses to deliver housing services to the public. The government swiftly introduced initiatives to protect people who'd lost their jobs and who had reduced or lost their incomes. Bob, can you tell us now what measures were introduced in Ireland in response to the pandemic that helped support people?
I'd like to talk about the restrictions that were introduced in the private rented sector. About 1 in 5 households in Ireland live in private rented accommodation. It was a sector that was already under pressure before the pandemic hit. So it was really important when the public health restrictions were introduced that people were able to remain in their rented homes. So the government introduced a blanket ban on evictions and an overall rent freeze for a period of 3 months. As restrictions started to become more calibrated, where people were allowed to move but within short distances, maybe 5 kilometres or 2 kilometres from their home, those restrictions around freezing rents and evictions were slightly changed to apply really to, at those times. And I suppose the other thing was there was a recognition that a large number of people who were renting had lost their jobs, had no source of income, as did landlords. So some of the restrictions were also related to people's financial capacity.
Bob, now that all COVID-19 lockdown restrictions have lifted since May this year, have any of the policy supports that you mentioned and measures that were put in place to protect vulnerable people living in this sector, in the private rented sector, being kept in place? Have we learned from any of the measures that have worked?
I think certainly in relation to rent arrears in the private rented sector, a number of measures were introduced during COVID-19. I suppose that changed the previous position. The previous position really was that a tenant could be evicted by a landlord without any real reference to the regulatory body for the private rented sector. During COVID-19, really the residential Tenancies Board needed to be notified when this was happening, and they could inform the landlord of their responsibilities, but also the tenant of their rights in that situation. And another government agency called the Money Advice and Budgeting Service also stepped in to provide advice to people on their financial situation. So that process has remained in place with the exception of the Money Advice Service. So in other words, the situation in relation to rent arrears and the oversight of the Residential Tenancies Board remains in place as a post kind of COVID-19 measure.
So I think it's true to say collaboration really has been one of the ways that during the lockdown that I suppose we were able to react and look after and mind the vulnerable population. And that was despite the challenges. So we're going to hear now from Julie Davis, who is in our local authority services team, and she's going to talk about how collaboration really helped develop the new strategy for people with a disability.
Thanks, Rosalind. I'm Julie Davis and I work on the local authority services team here in the Housing Agency. Our team engages with multiple external stakeholders on a daily basis. Prior to COVID, much of our engagement was through in-person meetings or conference calls. A significant shift occurred in the manner in which we progressed our work once Ireland entered into its first lockdown in March 2020. As our meetings went online, our capacity to engage with our stakeholders increased. This was particularly apparent in our work in undertaking a consultation process on the new housing strategy for disabled people led by our disability team. The consultation process started in early 2021. One of the most important things to consider was making the process as accessible and collaborative as possible. It was crucial the process was underpinned by the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which places disabled people at the heart of decision-making. The shift in methods of communication that occurred during the pandemic allowed us to put together a comprehensive two-phase online consultation process. Phase 1 entailed getting a broad view as possible on the issues facing disabled people accessing housing. The main method employed was an online questionnaire, which was open to the public. The questionnaire was made available in various accessible formats. They were enabled to allow the use of text-to-speech software, and an explainer video was also provided. There was a total of 1,608 responses, which was a very successful response rate in the Irish context. Phase 2 consisted of multiple online focus groups on the various themes that emerged in Phase 1. A total of 85 people attended, which included disabled people, housing practitioners, and representatives from health services. We engaged with the newly established Disability Participation and Consultation Network, which seeks to ensure that disabled people are actively engaged with and on disability policy and law. The Housing Agency was one of the first public bodies to engage with the network. To facilitate active participation by disabled people, we employed three main tools. We used a preferred online platform identified by disabled people. We facilitated those with alternative communication needs, such as those with visual or hearing impairments. And we circulated information in advance to attendees, along with an easy-to-read version of the information and an explainer video. What was really interesting was that overall, there was broad consistency in the views of attendees regarding the main issues, challenges, and potential solutions. The views also reinforced the draft themes that arose out of Phase 1. However, there was also some very strong feedback on living independently and being included in the community, which we took on board and made it an overarching principle of the strategy. In summary, while in-person events may have been initially preferable, the COVID-19 period did provide an opportunity for the Housing Agency to connect with people using different technologies and consult with a broad range of stakeholders, resulting in a hugely rich and meaningful consultation process. These alternative ways of connecting with stakeholders also inform how we do our work today and continue to be used by us in how we engage with stakeholders and those with lived experience.
So increased collaboration is emerging as a key theme in the discussion of how Ireland responded to the pandemic. It also facilitated a number of changes, the collaboration within the homelessness sector. So before joining the Housing Agency last year, Bob, you were the National Director of the Housing First programme in Ireland. So I suppose it would be good if you could tell me a little bit about some of the measures that were put in place during the pandemic at a local government and NGO level that helped protect the homeless population.
Well, I think the first thing to say is there was a strong recognition that homeless people could be very severely affected by COVID-19. Because of the Housing First programme and the strong collaboration that already exists between housing and health, we were well equipped to respond early. I think not-for-profit and homeless charities really were targeting people who were rough sleeping on the street to ensure that they got into safe, secure and suitable accommodation. Existing hostels and shelters that operated on a daytime basis were moved to 24-hour basis with food on site, and really what that ensured is people didn't have to move around or move outside hostels and shelters. I think the other thing was that a COVID-19 testing van went to the homeless population wherever they were to ensure they were tested and received an appropriate response. And I suppose the other thing would be that because there was a need to maintain social distancing in hostels and shelters, that people very often needed to be provided with more space, which often meant having less people in these hostels and shelters and creating new facilities to accommodate them.
Bob, can you tell us about the outcome from all of these measures that were introduced?
Well, the purpose of the measures was really to ensure that the homeless population were protected from COVID-19. The outcome was just 2% of the homeless population was infected, compared to kind of stats in other countries where 10% or more of people who are homeless were impacted. So clearly the measures worked. And I suppose the other good news is that these measures a lot of them have been retained. So in terms of hostels and shelters, they remain open on a 24-hour basis with food on site, so people don't have to move around. There's a lot more single bedroom accommodation for people coming in from the streets. And there are more health and wraparound services available within these facilities to ensure the well-being of people who are homeless.
Post-pandemic, there is a significant focus now on increasing housing supply. 90,000 social homes are to be delivered by 2030, and there's an additional target of 1,200 Housing First tenancies over the next 5 years. So reducing and preventing homelessness remains a top priority for the government. We're now going to hear from Rob Louth, who is Director of Housing First. He's going to tell us a little bit more about the challenges and solutions encountered during the pandemic.
Hello there, I'm Rob Louth, National Director for Housing First. For those of you who may not know, Housing First is a successful permanent solution to resolving long-term homelessness for single people. It successfully engaged individuals with a complex history of rough sleeping, long-term shelter usage, mental health difficulties, and those suffering from addiction. To date in Ireland, we've created 737 tenancies, with 400 alone being created during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 and 2021. The success of Housing First is only possible when the accommodation is combined with person-centred, community-based, recovery-orientated wraparound health and housing supports. When delivered together, our tenancies remain at an 87% success rate, a significant achievement during a pandemic. Tenants of Housing First were extremely vulnerable during the pandemic. Many had underlying health conditions, which was caused from a time sleeping rough in the past. And ensuring their health safety was a top priority for all stakeholders in the NGO service provision, local authorities, and health services. Tenants depended on the wraparound supports during lockdown periods. This was difficult with the task of social distancing and cocooning those considered high risk. In the early months of the pandemic, it became clear that tenants required higher levels of emotional support and mental health interactions. We must remember that homeless people are extremely social with their peers and members of the public. Forced isolation was difficult for all. To counteract the concerns, many regions developed various solutions, such as food drops, care packages, and media entertainment gifts, such as DVDs and CDs. However, the most important solution delivered to Housing First tenants was an intense emotional support delivered through virtual support teams developed through the NGO sector. Smartphones were provided to individuals who required levels of support that were being provided by the virtual teams. This depended on participants in terms of what they needed at a particular time. The service was very much client-led, with hundreds of connections made to tenants.
So there's been a substantial and rapid housing policy response to the challenges posed by COVID-19. Bob, what would you say are the positive lessons that we can take from all that was done during this period?
Well, I think the first thing is that that swift and decisive action can be taken in the face of a crisis to both protect people at risk of losing their homes in the private rented sector and provide accommodation and supports for people that are already homeless and sleeping on our streets. So that's really important. I think the second thing would be that collaboration between agencies is really important, between housing and health services in particular, but also the non-profit sector and regulatory bodies. And all of these bodies working together can produce a really positive outcome. And I suppose the final thing is the importance of a home of your own. That the safest place to be is in permanent housing that's both secure and affordable, and where you don't face the risk of losing that home. I'd really like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to your conference today. I mean, it's really important just to say that housing professionals have made a huge difference during the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of protecting people at risk of homelessness and also providing housing opportunities for people. So listen, I hope that the rest of your conference goes really well, and perhaps I can join you in person the next time.